So yeah, I don't know if anyone had a chance to watch that video on Democracy Now, but Spiegelman talks about his book being banned in this school district in Tennessee, which again, I mentioned this, several weeks ago, or a couple months ago when it first happened. Not surprisingly, but by this point, this is now kind of old news. But it is still significant, the idea that books are still being banned within the United States, and it really leads to a further discussion about censorship here in the United States, which I'd like to go over a little bit. But Spiegelman also talks about one of his influences, a guy by the name of Harvey Kurtzman. So I'd like to go into that. Let me set things up here a little bit. Get situated here, get my PowerPoint going. All right, so this is obviously an illustration of Spiegelman. This is actually, I think, in the back cover of Maus. You would have seen this illustration. This is, essentially for all intents and purposes, become, Spiegelman's kind of, persona, his cartoon persona. You see him there with his Camel cigarettes, his drawing tools. Okay, so again, Spiegelman mentions Harvey Kurtzman as one of his influences. So who was Harvey Kurtzman? Well, Harvey Kurtzman was an artist who, worked at a variety of different places going back to the 1940s, but really his reputation really stems from the 1950s, where he was working at this company known as EC Comics. And this is kind of an illustration here of EC Comics. I really like this illustration. It has a lot of personality and character. It was actually drawn by a woman named Marie Severin, who's actually pictured here, if you see, all the way in the background, holding this bucket of whitewash. And you see someone saying to her, "Now I want a good clean job." Marie Severin was an artist who worked in comics in the 1950s. She later went to Marvel Comics, did characters like the Hulk and Doctor Strange and probably various others. It's interesting because, of course, as this image itself illustrates, the world of comics was very much a men's world, a boys' club, whatever you want to call it. There weren't too many female artists working in it back then. There, frankly, still aren't that many today. I mean, although there are obviously, significantly more than there were back then. Marie Severin kind of stood out back then, though. There weren't. I can't even really think of another female artist from that era of time, although there may have been some that I'm just not aware of. But I like this image. It's well drawn. It has a lot of, like I said, personality and character to it. It also captures sort of like the personality of the various EC artists. Here you see Kurtzman towards the bottom with this sort of Napoleon outfit on. You see his name, Harvey Kurtz, and then the symbol for a man. Kurtzman was well known for his war comics back then. Particularly comics set during the time of the Korean War, which is actually sort of an ongoing conflict during that period of time, but also like, historical stuff as well. Like I think he did do comics about the Napoleonic Wars, things like that. So that's, explains his appearance there. A couple of the other artists I'd like to briefly talk about: Bernard Krigstein, pictured up here, painting a picture. That's important. Wallace Wood, dressed up like a knight over here. I mean, all these artists are very, interesting. I mean, they were, sort of like the Wu-Tang Clan of like comic book artists, and that they were all very talented. They all had their kind of distinct styles. And so EC Comics actually plays a very sort of important role in the history of comics, particularly in the history of the underground comics, which is where Spiegelman kind of comes from. Distinct from your sort of, mainstream superhero comics, Batman, Superman, Spider-Man, and all that. So the legacy of EC Comics is really that. It's this amazing collection of extremely talented artists. It's the other part of its legacy is that it is basically the company that helped introduce, unwittingly, of course, censorship within comic books. So in 1954, EC is sort of taken in front of Congress and has to testify in front of Congress due to what is considered to be the excessive violence and various other things that are portrayed in their comic books. Now, I purposely didn't include any images like that. You can certainly look them up. You can find the comic book with, a picture of a man hanging on it. You can find the comic book cover of a man holding a severed woman's head with an axe with dried blood on it. there was a lot of garish, violent stuff in it. I'm not saying that there wasn't. However, I think that unfairly characterizes what was going on here. There were many different stories, a lot of different stuff coming out there. Some of it was violent. Some of it, though, I would say was fairly progressive for its time. So it had fairly, progressive politics. And again, usually had very, talented artists working on them, even when they were doing fairly violent stuff. But as a result, an entity known as the Comics Code Authority was created in the 1950s, which basically introduced censorship within comics. So this sort of dovetails with the story of Spiegelman, in that Spiegelman is, book was recently censored as well. And I think it does bring up an important, hypocrisy within American culture. And I think I've addressed already some of the hypocrisies of American life. We're always being told that we live in a free society and things like that. Yet we lack many basic rights, which are, considered human rights in many parts of the world. Another aspect of that is that we live in one of the most heavily censored cultures in the world, or mass culture here within the United States is among the most heavily censored of any country in the world, and still to this day to a large extent, but especially back then, especially from this era of time. So we've talked about this to a certain extent. Movies being censored in the 1930s, the Hays Code, which remains in effect basically until the modern day rating system is introduced in the late 1960s. Comics are censored in the 1950s, moving things up to the 1980s and 90s, music, video games. So, it does kind of undermine this claim that we live in the freest society in the world. We actually live in a very heavily censored, the culture in this society is actually very heavily censored. And it does kind of go back to what, Adorno was talking about, this idea of what he calls the administered world. And this is, a prime example of this. I mean, you literally have the government administrations basically telling people what's appropriate content to produce within mass culture. And I guess the one sort of cop out to that is that you could say, well, this was self-imposed censorship. The Comics Code Authority was created by the comic book industry. Same thing with like the Hays Code and stuff like that. It's like, yes, that is true, but it also clearly emerged as a result of government pressure. I mean, again, EC Comics was taken in front of Congress and forced to testify in front of members of Congress. And the message coming from the government was quite clear. Either you clean yourself up, or we're going to clean, do this job for you. Basically, we're going to clean things up for you. And so, yes, the censorship may have technically been self-imposed. It may have not been a result of like a formal act of legislation passed by the Congress, but it clearly, arose as a result of government censorship. And the result of it is, again, a very heavily censored culture. And it leads to, well, I mean, just some of the things that come out of the Comics Code, which also you would find in the Hays Code for movies. Good must always triumph over evil. Authority figures, policemen, politicians, etc. Institutions of American life are always to be portrayed in a good light. You can't show corrupt cops or anything like that, or corrupt politicians or things like that. And what that leads to is people not taking art seriously. It becomes just a diversion. It becomes entertainment. And one of the things I like most about the Frankfurt School theorists, and I do take some issue with things that with their approach on certain things. But one thing that I do admire about them is that they all take art very seriously, right? For them, art is not just a diversion. It's not just entertainment. It's something that's supposed to tell the truth. Basically, it's supposed to, reveal or tell a truth about the world. And people are supposed to learn from it. They're supposed to, in a sense, grow and develop because of it. And when you impose, arbitrary things like good must always triumph over evil, you undermine that ability. Then art can't be truthful anymore, because as we all know, good does not always triumph over evil in real life. So when you introduce things like that, you undermine the ability for art to be truthful. And what you get is people who don't take art very seriously, which I think is still very much a predominant issue that we have today. I don't think most people do take. They just regard it as entertainment, basically. Another thing is that it also stifles the development of art. It makes art become infantile, especially with comic books. When you're forced to introduce, themes like that, the good always has to triumph over evil, authority figures always have to be portrayed in a good light. It makes it impossible to tell mature adult stories, and what you're left basically is something that's only suitable for children, basically. And many comics historians have pointed out that the introduction of the Comics Code in the 1950s basically set comics back decades. It basically, stifled the development of the medium, where it would take, 30 years maybe for it to really sort of, catch up to it, and catch up to what was going on in other countries as well, in France, in Japan, in various other places, in Argentina, which had a very vibrant, comic scene for a while. A lot of important artists come out of there. And Spiegelman talks about that. A big part of what Spiegelman's legacy is as an artist, as someone within the comics industry itself, is to publicize issues like this, to introduce, foreign comics within the United States, and point to, be like, look what they're doing in these other countries here. They're so much more advanced than us because they don't have this sort of arbitrary censorship basically imposed upon them. So that is part of the legacy of EC Comics. It's interesting, again, if you want to look up some of the more garish stuff, and they, like I said, I already, alluded to some of it. This guy here, Ghastly Graham Angles, as he was known, created the Crypt Keeper, the series Tales from the Crypt horror series. I think Johnny Craig over here did the violent covers that I mentioned just a while ago. So, all right, so let's talk a little bit more about Kurtzman. So Kurtzman is most known for doing these kinds of comics. He's most known for doing these kind of war comics. And he's also really known, I guess his most important legacy is as the creator of Mad, which was originally a comic book series, actually, before becoming the magazine, the sort of, satirical magazine, and a big influence, again, on Spiegelman. But early on, in the earlier 1950s, Kurtzman was doing these kind of war comics. And this was one of his more famous stories. It's known as Corpse on the Imjin, which basically takes place during the Korean War. So a lot of his stories, again, dating from the early 1950s, run concurrent with the Korean War, which itself is sort of a chapter of American history that is rarely talked about anymore. It's almost like the forgotten war in American history, even though, of course, it was very important. So I would also say that, comics are a good way to sort of introduce this idea, or sort of explain this idea of form and content, which is something I mentioned several classes ago. But it's a way of sort of, approaching art and understanding art. So, the content basically refers to what the story is about, right? And the form is basically how the story is basically being told. So comic books, I think, are a good example of explaining form, because what are the sort of the formal aspects of the comic? It's the drawing style of the artist, which you can see here, Kurtzman style. Lots of heavy use of blacks, very thick lines. Many people, say that his characters have almost kind of like a rubbery look to them. But also the formal aspects are, again, how the story is told, the page layouts, the panel layouts, and things like that. So Kurtzman is famous for this kind of rhythm of panels, which you can see here with the 3 panels, which kind of, give you a sense of motion and timing. Now this story, it's a pretty dark story, right? It's basically about 2 soldiers who get into a fight, and one of them drowns the other one, hence the term Corpse on the Imjin. And it's an American soldier and a Korean soldier. And you can see them here, at the top tier of panels, basically, struggling within the water. The American soldier starts to drown him. You see it again, in very sort of this 3-panel motion, this 3-panel rhythm, slowly drowning him. And again, sort of conveys the sense of time passing as he's doing it. And then he emerges and walks out of the river. And then the opposing page, and this would have been basically how the page layout would have appeared if you were reading the book. It's unfortunate that the other page is kind of like yellowed and doesn't really match well with the other page, but that's the best example I could find. You again sort of see, you see the corpse sort of floating in the river and floating away, and then you see this sort of wide image of the corpse floating in the river. Now, if you look at the whole story, and this is only a 6-page story, The opening panel of the story also shows you another corpse floating on the river. So it kind of bookends that image. The story begins with a corpse floating on the river, a different corpse, and then it basically ends with this man who's just this Korean soldier is basically just drowned in the river. So again, pretty dark story. I mean, pretty dark in terms of content. But again, you can also see the sort of the formal aspects of the story here. Again, Kurtzman's style of drawing, the layout of the panels, the kind of rhythm he establishes with the panels there. So the reason why these comics are considered important in history in that they sort of stand out. I mean, Kurtzman was not necessarily anti-war, but he refused to sort of glamorize war. And probably more importantly, he refused to dehumanize the enemy. He refused to dehumanize, the Korean communists that we were fighting against during this war, which unfortunately does stand out from what most of, not just comics were doing, but most of American culture at this period of time. It wasn't too long before this where, comics were depicting, Japanese people with like fangs, literally like they were some kind of like subhuman species. And of course, the kind of, simplistic, Cold War mentality, which took hold after World War II, was very much on display in most other aspects of culture. In fact, a decade after this, in the 1960s, if you look at a lot of the Marvel comics from that era, the superhero comics, I mean, they're pretty embarrassing in terms of the sort of Cold War politics on display. In other words, you see a lot of, one-dimensional communist bad guys going up against Iron Man and Captain America. Even Thor would take a break every now and then from his, cosmic space adventures to go down and, fight the Viet Cong for an issue, which is actually, an actual thing. Even Spider-Man, who's supposed to be a more, down-to-earth superhero, would fight, communist spies in his early appearances and things like that. So Kurtzman didn't do that. He didn't dehumanize the enemy. He didn't treat them in this sort of one-dimensional fashion. And there were a lot of other war comics, not necessarily superhero stuff, but there were a lot of other war comics around this time period, which were very much, in that same mold of the Marvel comics, being extremely jingoistic, nationalistic, portraying, the enemy as this very one-dimensional kind of dehumanized way. Captain America comics from this era, from the 1950s. Captain America is a character created in the 1940s, but by the 1950s, the title actually read, Captain America Commie Smasher, and that would actually be what you'd see across the title of the comic book. So Kurtzman's comic, his war comics kind of stand out in that regard. And again, I mean, it's played a very big influence, not just on Spiegelman, but really on what became known as the underground comics scene or the underground comics movement of the late 1960s. If people like Jack Kirby are sort of the source out of which all sort of mainstream superhero comics came out of, Kurtzman sort of plays that same role for the underground comics. He's sort of like the common source, the Father, basically, in which all the the underground artists kind of followed in. But that's one aspect of what Kurtzman did. He's probably most known, though, or his most important legacy, again, as I said, is probably the founder of Mad, which was also published by EC Comics. So again, here's a humorous, satirical comic. Here you have, war comics also being published by EC, which take a more sort of politically progressive view of things. And all that stuff kind of coexisted with the more garish, sort of, trashy horror stuff. And it is trashy. I mean, the reason why I'm not showing that stuff, and again, you can look it up yourself. I gave you some examples of it, is because that was sort of how I was sort of introduced to EC Comics. And I'm not for censorship, but I saw that stuff. I was like, oh God, this is, horrible. I would never want to read something like this. And that kind of, gave me a very sort of negative first impression of EC Comics. I'm not denying that it exists, but I think it does sort of mischaracterize things a little bit when you only focus on that garish, horrific stuff. But really there was, a lot of different content coming out. So Mad was part of that as well. And it's probably tough to appreciate the importance of Mad today, which I guess is still published as a magazine. people that grew up with it, describe it as like like The Simpsons and like Daily Show rolled into one, which I could kind of understand. I mean, I love The Simpsons growing up. Not so much The Daily Show, although I kind of liked it. The Simpsons I loved. Simpsons, much like Mad Magazine, continues to be published to this very day, or continues to be made to this very day, but doesn't really seem to have the same relevancy that it once did. Probably the first 6 or 7 seasons of The Simpsons, I think, are still classic. Fortunately, the show's been on the air for like 30 seasons or like something like that. So the vast majority of it probably isn't as good as those first several seasons. But those first several seasons are great. And again, a great example of satire. Simpsons, by the way, also created by another guy to come out of the underground comic scene, Matt Groening. So there's kind of that connection to it as well. And Matt, so Kurtzman sort of served as editor. He didn't draw all the stories. He sort of cherry picked, I guess, some of the best Mad artists, some of the best EC artists, including, the 4 most important ones were Jack Davis, Bill Elder, who kind of here looks like Alfred E. Newman, the Mad mascot, Wallace Wood, and John Severin. John Severin was actually Maurice Severin's brother. And some of the others would occasionally do stories. Kriegstein did a couple stories, and some other artists did too. But Kurtzman sort of assembled these guys together. Kurtzman would usually draw the covers. I mean, this isn't a good example. These are obviously, parodies of famous art paintings, but many of the covers would be like a Kurtzman-like drawing with these kind of rubbery looking characters. He would do layouts inside the comic, which are sort of like rough outlines basically of the stories, and then have these other guys come in and put the finishing touches on it. And Kurtzman is generally credited, and I guess maybe his most important legacy is more as an editor, essentially, and sort of reining these guys in, and kind of he's almost always attributed as sort of getting these guys to sort of like level up, really sort of up their skills as artists. Particularly Wood, who's probably my favorite of this group of artists. But here you have Mad, obviously a reference to the Mona Lisa. This one here is actually kind of a callback to a previous class when we were talking about painting and the evolution of abstract painting. I showed this example, Picasso's Girl Before a Mirror. Here you have that being referenced there. So I don't know what too much else I could say about Mad other than it was very important. I guess it's worth questioning. Where do you get that source of satire today in contemporary society? Because it is such an important thing. And again, Spiegelman talks about that too. And his sort of take on Mad is, why it's important is that, what's his phrase? Is that like, the elites are lying to you basically, and we are too, meaning, the guys making Mad magazine. So basically don't believe anything we say. And that kind of subversiveness, this kind of, yes, what, the politicians and all the people that we're not allowed to say are corrupt and things like that, they're actually completely full of shit. They're lying to you, they're lying about everything basically. Don't believe them. Don't trust them. And I think it's a very sort of important thing. That's a very sort of healthy thing that you need to have in a democracy. You need to be able to question the leaders and question what's going on. And that really is the role I think that satire plays. And I was thinking about it, before class, like where do people really get that satire now? I mean, again, Mad is still around, but I don't, it's kind of a shell of its former self. So is The Simpsons, basically. You could also say that about The Daily Show. Whoops, I clicked over by mistake. I mean, where do people get that satire now? I actually had to think about it. It was kind of hard to come up with anything. Is that a sign that of the times? I mean, is that where has society become so humorless and so sort of like dried up that we don't really have satire anymore? I'm curious where people get that from, because it is an important thing. I guess the Chapo Trop House podcast is a pretty good example of modern day satire. Although even they you can listen to like half their shows, and then like the other half are like, you have to subscribe to some kind of premium service or something like that. Although a lot of them do end up on YouTube, and they don't seem to, police it very heavily. The movies of Adam McKay are a pretty good example. I just recently saw that movie, Don't Look Up, with Leonardo DiCaprio and Jennifer Lawrence. That was pretty good. But it doesn't seem that there are that many examples of satire left. And again, it's an unfortunate thing, because that kind of subversiveness is, I think, very much a healthy thing. All right, so that pretty much covers Kurtzman. But I'd like to briefly talk about some of the other artists from back then. Wally Wood, or Wallace Wood. I think he hated being called Wally Wood, and wouldn't you? Because it kind of sounds like a cartoon character. Was probably one of their most accomplished artists, probably the most accomplished artist to come out of EC. And this is one of his stories. For Kurtzman's war comics, he had two. One was known as Two-Fisted Tales. The other one was known as Frontline Combat. And this is a story from Two-Fisted Tales, drawn by Wallace Wood. I got to get out of the habit of calling him that. Obviously about the atomic bombing of, well, this one is actually Nagasaki, the second atomic bombing. And again, so this would have been published by EC Comics. I'm not sure of the exact date, but I'm guessing early 1950s. And again, I think this kind of stands out. I mean, even to this very day, you see people defending the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And what you see here in this story is, again, an attempt to humanize the so-called other, which you weren't really seeing. Like I mentioned a moment ago, it wasn't too long before this, the Japanese people were being portrayed as kind of some sort of subhuman species or something like that. And here you clearly see the so-called human element here. The Japanese people are actually human beings, and they weren't all fanatical kamikaze pilots. And you see quite clearly here, the toll that this takes, the human suffering that this inflicts upon people. You see, old people, you see children being caught up in this. The mailman, who I believe is portrayed here with bandages. So this is also a bit of a contrast, right? The first image is in color, the other image is in black and white. Now these comics are usually drawn in black and white and then usually colored afterwards. So this is how it would have appeared if you were buying this issue back then. It would have appeared in color like this. But this is actually what the original art would have looked like. And again, I actually think this is fairly progressive for its period of time. And not to get into the whole debate over the dropping of these atomic bombs on Japan, which I don't, by the way, agree should have been done, but I don't really want to get into all that. But even just to appreciate again Wood's art, it's incredibly detailed. I mean, look at the way these faces are rendered here on the second page, or look at this background panel here. If you can see my cursor circling it, I mean, look at the amount of detail that's sort of crammed into this tiny little panel. It's pretty impressive, I think. I mean, it's one thing to draw something that detailed for an image that takes up like a full page, or even sometimes occasionally both pages, but to cram that much detail into a small little panel like that is pretty impressive. Again, on the other side, on the right hand side, you see these the characters in shadow. This is sort of a signature technique of Wood, the so-called what they call double lighting, where you see the light on either side of the face and then the shadow coming down the middle of the face. It may not sound like much, but I know from reading interviews with artists, I mean, it took them like years, in some cases, to sort of figure out how he was doing that, and sort of crack the code on that. Anyway, I don't have too much more to say about that. Impressive looking artwork, very detailed, interesting use of light and shadow and things like that. And again, form and content. So the content of the story, focusing on the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, I would say, and in a way that's kind of humanizes the people and sort of, shows you the vast, human toll and cost that this thing inflicted upon people, I think was fairly progressive for its era. And then, all right, so the last artist I want to talk about before going into Spiegelman himself is Bernard Krigstein. And I think you'll see why his story in particular relates well to what Spiegelman is. But before I even get into that, here's another aspect of sort of, the formal aspects of the so-called language of comics. And here, again, you see how through, panel layouts and things like that, they're able to convey a very, interesting experience of time, right? So you see this man running. Yeah, I mean, you could have easily done this in like 2 panels, right? You see a guy running and then he falls in front of the train. But Krigstein is able to sort of, prolong this moment, to literally like slow down the flow of time and draw it out so that you see it in excruciatingly slow detail, right? This slow, deliberate rhythm. You see the guy stumbling and falling, writhing around as he falls off the platform. You see this moment here right before the train hits him, very, tense. You see this image here, these sort of repeating faces, which is an interesting technique. If anyone's ever looked into a subway car as it's speeding by, you would see the sort of like blurring effect, right? You wouldn't necessarily see the same people, obviously, as Krigstein is drawn here, but you would see this kind of blurring of faces as the subway car speeds by. So it's very interesting, again, in the sort of the formal aspects of the comics language. There was an Alfred Hitchcock movie called Shadow of a Doubt, which has a very sort of similar scene. I wonder if that was an influence on Krigstein when he did this. But I've just been talking about the formal aspects of it. I'd like to briefly go over this story. It's a short story. It's only about eight pages long, but I think you'll see it fits very well in with Spiegelman's Maus. That has to do with Nazis, basically. I can switch screens. That's not what I'm trying to do. Okay. Right. So go here. I'm going to try to switch this to full screen mode because it can allow us to see things a little bit better. I like to try to, as much as I can, get the full screen on. So everyone could still see my screen, right? You can still see the web browser screen. So you can look at it like this. You can click on each image, but I prefer to do it like this because I think it makes the image show up a little bit bigger. Move this over here. So this is a story by Krigstein from 1955, also by EC Comics, known as Master Race. And again, fairly interesting for this period of time in that you're talking about Nazis. And what the story is about, basically, the man that we see falling off the subway platform at the end is a former Nazi. He's a Nazi who has escaped Germany, who's come to the United States, who's sort of, living, as a normal person, concealing his Nazi past. And we'll go through this fairly quickly, but because it is a fairly short story. And so you see this guy hanging out. He's confronted by he one day notices a Jewish man who he obviously has some connection with get on the subway train. He freaks out about it. I like this detail here, doing the sort of the colored advertisements up there, and then so we sort of get into this. So again, I'm assuming everyone can still see this, but now you sort of flash back to Nazi Germany, and you see all the stuff. You see the swastikas, the large gatherings of people, the fanatics, these wide-eyed stares going Sieg Heil. You see Hitler here, in red, very much looking like the devil. And then you see, stuff, so a very condensed version, obviously, of the atrocities inflicted by the Nazis upon the Jewish people. And you see things like book burnings. So again, censorship, a very, more brutal, direct form of censorship. But, in essence, not all that different from banning books and things like that. And you see them, it's interesting, the names that are written here. Heinrich Heine, famous German poet, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, Thomas Mann. You see, again, Jewish people being forced to wear the Star of David, having Jude painted on their storefront windows and things like that, beatings by the, oh no, I'm sorry. And these are people who were not Jewish, who were also, victimized by the Nazis. So it's Krigstein pointing out to you that, this didn't only happen to Jewish people either. It did happen to other people as well. And you see again being put in the concentration camps, the barbed wire, machine guns. This is an especially disturbing image here. This lower panel, people walking by covering their noses. So, the Germans knew what was going on. They at least had some inkling of what was going on. I mean, read the caption here. Do you remember the stinking odor of human flesh burning in the ovens? Men's, women's, children's, people you once knew and talked to and drank beer with. So, I don't believe, like in the idea of collective guilt or something like that, or that everybody should be punished. But, I mean, a lot of the German people did probably have an idea of what was going on back then. And it goes on, the human experiments. Dr. Mengele, the famous, the infamous German, surgeon, talks about the human lampshades, or lampshades made of human skin. All the stuff is real and true, as grotesque as it is to imagine. This image here, people being buried alive, as it says here, laughing wildly as they buried their victims alive. And you see women, children, and of course men being buried alive by the Germans. I mean, pretty brutal stuff, especially for the 1950s. And this is the Jewish man saying, someday I'll get you, Reisman, I'll get you if it's the last thing I do. And he does, right? So flash forward to the present day being, of course, the 1950s. The Jewish man recognizes Reisman. He flips out. He starts running away. He's chasing him down the line. It's revealed at the end that Reisman, commanded the Belsen concentration camp. The Belsen concentration camp, by the way, is a concentration camp that Anne Frank died in. And of course, the diary of Anne Frank would have been first published in the late 1940s. Aside from that, probably not too many other examples of the atrocities of the Nazis really being highly publicized at that time. Of course, the diary of Anne Frank doesn't really cover it either. It covers her time living and hiding from the Germans, but you don't know what happens to her afterwards, other than the fact that she died at this concentration camp, which is attested to by people later on. But it is an interesting. I don't know if it's a coincidence. I don't know if that's why Kriegstein picked that concentration camp, but that is where Anne Frank died. And again, the diary of Anne Frank would have been known to people by this period of time. And again, here you have this famous sequence that I showed at the beginning. Now, sort of, in context, knowing what's going on in the storyline, he's running away, he stumbles, he falls, the train comes upon him. I cut off this lower panel here, or this lower tier of panels here, but then people come out and say, oh, what happened to that guy? He denies knowing him, and that's it. And that's basically how the story ends. So short story, only 8 pages long. Here would have been the cover, drawn by Jack. I think that's Jack Davis's signature. Yeah, oh yeah, it says it right there, from 1955. So Kriegstein, very interesting artist. Didn't work in comics very long. I think only did maybe about less than 10 years or so. Later did book cover illustrations. Then later became a painter, actually. So if you remember that image drawn by Marie Severin, shows him sort of painting in a very kind of modernist painting style. I mean, that is actually what he did. So he must have always had those kinds of interests going back then, and actually did become a painter, which is kind of interesting. I have seen some of his paintings. I didn't include any examples of them, but they are worth checking out. They kind of, I don't know if they would have been that current with the style at that time, that kind of abstract expressionism. His paintings, from what I've seen at least, seem like more in the style of kind of, I guess, would be considered post-impressionism or expressionism, which is okay for me. That's actually my favorite style of painting. But so worth checking out if you never have, or worth checking out some of his other comics. He's a very interesting artist. Very, very different from Wood, very different from Kurtzman. So that also underscores the other point I'm trying to make, is that all these artists have very distinct styles. And I would probably, I probably like Wood the most, followed by Kriegstein. Kurtzman's style, I don't think it's bad, but probably doesn't appeal to me as much as the others. But again, Kurtzman as an editor, I think that, as a guy who sort of, whipped these other guys into shape, so to speak, and sort of leveled them up a little bit, I think is where his most important legacy lies. Kurtzman also taught at the School of Visual Arts in Manhattan. It's a very famous art school, along with Spiegelman. Spiegelman also taught, or maybe still does teach, I'm not sure, at the School of Visual Arts. So they knew each other. They were close. Kriegstein also taught, but it wasn't at the School of Visual Arts. I forget the name of the school that he taught at as well. So anyway, and one other thing while I'm here. So like I said, there weren't that many depictions of the Holocaust back then. You see a little bit in the Kriegstein story. You don't even really get a depiction of the Holocaust in the Diary of Anne Frank, but you do, learn a little bit about the plight of Jewish people living under Nazi occupation. I want to show a brief clip from this movie called The Stranger, directed by Orson Welles, who also stars in the movie, along with Edward G. Robinson and Loretta Young. This movie, which came out in 1946, is the first American movie to depict footage of real life concentration camps. It's often credited as the first movie, period. I don't think that's actually true. I think there was a movie that came out in the Soviet Union prior to this, and a movie that came out in Poland prior to this, which also depict footage of concentration camps. But the first American movie, at least, to depict footage of concentration. So the story of the movie is that Loretta Young, Orson Welles plays a Nazi, very, very similar to the character in the previous story, who has escaped from Nazi Germany, now living in the United States under a different identity. He's either married or I think engaged to Loretta Young. Edward G. Robinson plays basically a law enforcement official. Doesn't work for the United States government. I think works for the United Nations or something like that, who's basically a Nazi hunter. And he knows that Orson Welles is a Nazi. He's trying to get Loretta Young to sort of give him up. And so he basically shows her footage of concentration camps as a way to persuade her. So I'll show that. It's pretty brief. It's just a couple minutes. There's not a lot of footage, but it is, again, basically the first film to show that. Let's see if I can make the screen.
In charge of one of the more efficient concentration camps. You know him, don't you? You have met him here in Harbor.
No, I've never seen that man, Mr. Wilson.
That guy was a guy, another Nazi who tracked down Welles, who Welles actually kills, and Edward G. Robinson knows about it, and okay. I don't want to play too much of that because obviously we have a lot to talk about. Very good movie, worth checking out. Orson Welles is a great director, mostly known for Citizen Kane. Most people probably don't even watch that movie anymore. But even people that do, tend to overlook his other films. But I think all of his movies are pretty interesting, worth watching. So, all right. So talked a little bit about Kurtzman, big influence on Spiegelman. Talked about some of the other EC artists who were also a big influence on Spiegelman. He may not have mentioned them in that interview with Democracy Now!, but I've heard him talk about them in other places. Master Race by Kriegstein, obviously a big influence on him as well. So let's talk a little bit about Spiegelman now himself before we get into this book. So Maus was, this is sort of the, I'm going to try to move through this faster because as usual, I'm running out of time and I haven't even gotten to talking about Maus yet, but this is the original version of Maus, published in the early 1970s. And you can see it's a different art style, much more reminiscent of the kind of the so-called underground comic style of the late 60s and 70s. This is only about a three-page story. So I have the first page, the second page. I don't have the third page, but there's not much more to it than that. Similar scenes, obviously the motif of using, portraying the Jews as mice, the Germans as cats. Some of the, famous scenes which play out in Maus, you see here, like this one person ratting out, no pun intended, the people living above, or maybe I should say pun intended, the people, hiding out here, which is also portrayed in, the later version of Maus as well. Not much more else to say about that. It's just that, this goes back to the early 1970s. So Spiegelman had been working on this idea, had been, sort of refining his approach to this idea for a very long time. If you consider that the second volume of Maus doesn't come out until 1991, this is basically like a 20-year project, at least. Spiegelman, besides doing Maus, is probably most known for being the editor of this anthology magazine known as Raw Magazine, which he worked on with his wife, Francois Moulet, who also is currently the art director for the New Yorker magazine. Spiegelman also did several covers for the New Yorker, which I'll show a couple of examples of them real briefly. But Raw is very important, again, in the history of underground comics. This is the first and second issues. The first issue, the guy sitting on the chair reading the newspaper. You can't really see it here. It's very blurred, but it includes Art Spiegelman's Two-Fisted Painters, a reference to Kurtzman's Two-Fisted Tales, which is sort of like a mini comic that was sort of like attached into the main issue here, which is quite big, sort of like an oversized magazine. Jacques Tardet's Manhattan. Again, Spiegelman played a big role in sort of introducing European comics to an American audience. I think also played a role in introducing Japanese manga to an American audience as well, although other people besides that, introduced, earlier newspaper comic strips from the early 20th century that were kind of lost, sort of mentored a lot of the next generation of underground artists, later, I guess, referred to as alternative comics or indie comics. Often cases, Spiegelman sort of, cherry picked some of his best students at the School of Visual Arts to contribute to the magazine as well. Beginning with issue 2 of Raw, pictured here on the right-hand side, the first installment of Maus was actually published, also basically as a sort of mini comic published or sort of attached within the comic. It even says it here on the lower bar, Maus, a survivor's tale. These are some of Spiegelman's covers for the New Yorker. So Spiegelman began doing covers for the New Yorker in 1992. This is his first cover here, a picture of a Hasidic man kissing an African-American woman. Was considered controversial for its time. There were race riots in New York City, in Brooklyn, in the Crown Heights section of Brooklyn in the early 1990s between Hasidic Jews and African Americans. So this idea of them, kissing each other was a kind of commentary on that. Here you see, children on laptops. This is actually from 2001, so it's much later on. Kids smoking a cigarette. I'll move through these pretty quickly, but here, one cover from 1993, showing children, carrying guns to school. Kind of a sad commentary on where we are now, that we're still talking about these things decades later. In fact, I was kind of surprised about this. I mean, I know when Columbine happened in 1999, that was very, very shocking and sort of unprecedented for that time. I guess there must have been instances of school shootings before then as well. I know the Pearl Jam song Jeremy talks about that. That's also from the early 1990s. I played a Pearl Jam video several weeks ago in class, Do the Evolution, which is kind of like the condensed version of Dialectic of Enlightenment in a music video, basically. Here you have another cover from 1999. Again, another issue that we're sadly still dealing with today, the rampant, police violence, the willingness of police officers to shoot people with very little provocation. You see here the 41 shots. This is a reference to the killing of Amadou Diallo around this period of time in 1999, who shot 41 times, an unarmed black man who shot 41 times by NYPD officers during the administration of Rudy Giuliani. Giuliani was known, for being very tolerant of police violence. Supposedly, I saw a documentary once called "It's Giuliani Time," which apparently is a phrase that the police officers would use when they're about to, beat somebody up in the interrogation room or something like that, signaling that the NYPD knew that they had the backing of the mayor, that they could more or less do what they wanted with impunity. So kind of a commentary on that. Here's his September 11th cover. The shadows of the twin towers. I think if you're actually holding up this issue, you would almost have to hold it in the right way or lighting to even see it. Otherwise, it would just look like an all black cover. I think this is his last cover for the New Yorker, dropping turkeys over Afghanistan. Kind of a commentary on that. This idea that we're going to help out the people of Afghanistan or anything like that. Now, Spiegelman later quit the New Yorker, citing what he considered to be the very, very sort of cowardly approach of the media to the Bush administration. And I'd like to talk about that more in a future class. But the New Yorker, much like most of the other so-called liberal media in this country, also came out in favor of the invasion of Iraq in 2003. A very important thing I don't want to gloss over. We don't have too much time to talk about it now. But that apparently was one of the reasons why Spiegelman quit, or he quit even before the invasion of Iraq. But leading up to that, he already, I guess, kind of saw the way things were going. This is his later book, In the Shadow of No Towers. All right, so predictably, I spent too much time talking about this, and now I barely have enough time to talk about Maus. So let me get into that now. Beginning with the cover, very striking image. I first became aware of this as a kid. I remember seeing this, this cover image and being very captivated. It took me several years to actually get around to reading Maus. I'm going to try to bring this up to full screen so you can see it a little bit better. But yeah, so let me just get right into it. So I'm mostly going to skip over the first chapter because the first chapter basically just deals with sort of setting the stage, right, for what happens. So the book is about Spiegelman's father living as a Jew in occupied Poland and later going to Auschwitz. And that's what I was told the story was about. So I was quite surprised when reading it, seeing how much of it deals with Spiegelman's relationship with his father as a younger man. This is the prologue when Spiegelman's a child, but most of the story deals with him as an adult, basically dealing with his father when he's much older. And you can read the opening caption here or from the first chapter. I went out to see my father in Rego Park. I hadn't seen him in a long time. We weren't that close. So he establishes right away he's not particularly close with his father. And some people have criticized that. And I'll address maybe some more of the criticisms next class. But some people criticize how Spiegelman portrays his father in the present day, or the present day as it exists here in the storyline. Some people, I mean, I guess one thing you have to get out of the way right away. Some people criticize Spiegelman's choice of portraying, the characters as animals, as talking animals, basically, which is sort of a long-standing trope in comics literature and fantasy literature. Some people feel that, by you portraying the Jews as mice and things like that, that it diminishes the impact of the story. Did anyone have that experience reading this? Did anyone feel that this diminished the impact of the storyline reading it like this? And of course, this, predates things like, Schindler's List and other movies that have dealt with the Holocaust. Not everything. I mean, there were documentaries about the Holocaust. I know one from the 1950s called Night and Fog, another one from the 1980s, Shoah, which is like 9.5 hours long. I don't know how many movies there were, though, that really depicted this experience in a brutal way, like you would see in a movie like Schindler's List, for example. So this predates that by several years. I mean, personally, I don't feel that it does. So I don't know if anyone else had that impression. I don't feel that it diminishes the impact of the storyline. I think it's fairly clever. I mean, besides the fact that this is a long-established tradition in comics literature, it sort of subverts a stereotype or propaganda that the Germans used against the Jews, which would be to portray them or refer to them as vermin, basically, as rats or mice. Rats, being even more unpleasant, I guess, than mice. But so in that regard, I think it's a sort of a clever way of sort of subverting this sort of negative stereotype or negative trope and sort of turning it, essentially turning it back against these people. So again, I'm trying to move through this fairly quickly. Again, the first chapter basically deals with Vladek, who was Spiegelman's father, sort of before Nazi occupation, just sort of establishing who he is. He's sort of a man about town. He has some female admirers. He's sort of affluent, upper middle class. You see him with his family, an extended family, which is very sad because you'll see these people gradually sort of dwindle away during the course of the storyline. And it sort of cuts back and forth between Vladek's history living in Poland and sort of Spiegelman dealing with his father in the present day. Okay. So again, I'm going to move through this pretty quickly. But you see the first real appearance that you see of the swastika here when they're actually visiting, they're going through Czechoslovakia. And I believe this is it says it right here, 1938. So Hitler occupied several countries, right, before war actually began. He occupied Austria, he occupied parts of Czechoslovakia, then all of Czechoslovakia, all basically before the war begins in September 1939, when the Germans invade Poland. So they're living in Poland, but they're going through to Czechoslovakia at this point in time. I believe Vladek is taking his wife to a sanitarium, and this is the first time that they see a swastika. And again, the layout of the panels here and the page is kind of interesting in that it's portrayed basically dead center, right? It's right in the center of the page, and you see all the people looking at it in this sort of directional device, sort of pointing your attention that way. So I think it's fairly clever. Another thing I should point out is that Spiegelman talks about this. He mentioned it in the Democracy Now! Interview, and he talks about, of course, during this book as well. His mother commits suicide. So it's also very sad as well, because you see his mother as a younger woman with Vladek. The woman he's with in the present day is Spiegelman's stepmother, basically. It's not his actual mother. It's another woman that Vladek has married. So sort of seeing his mother as a younger woman and knowing what eventually happens to her is, is quite sad and heartbreaking, of course. You also learn about Spiegelman's older brother, who did not survive the experience of the war either. So, and then again, it's hard to get the Zoom panels to be where I want them to do, because they're obstructing the pages here. But here, so I might just keep moving it back and forth. But so here you see them hearing stories of what's going on to Jews in Germany at this point in time. And again, similar imagery to what you would have seen in a story like Master Race, for example. And I don't know if it's intentional or not. I assume it is intentional. But the Spiegelman doesn't actually portray the swastika completely. It's always sort of partially obstructed. Even here, the fold of the flag kind of obstructs it. And all the other images here, it's at least partially obstructed by something. I don't know. I'm assuming that's a deliberate choice on Spiegelman. Like, he doesn't want to actually show you, the entire swastika or something like that. But again, you see stuff that's going on here. Spiegelman gets drafted into the army. So all this is taking place before even Poland is occupied. But this is basically where it begins. So Spiegelman's drafted into the army to fight against the Germans. This is kind of almost like a funny scene. There are some weird moments of humor in the story, mostly with Spiegelman dealing with his father in the present day. But here's a scene here where he's being yelled at by his Polish officer. The Poles, by the way, are portrayed as pigs. And that's another thing that the Spiegelman gets criticized for. What's he trying to say about the Polish people? Why is he portraying them as pigs? Spiegelman, for whatever reason, has never seemed to come up with a satisfactory answer for that. So I don't know if it is a negative portrayal of the Polish people. He does portray Polish people in the story, and I think in a more even-handed way. Some of them are portrayed as being anti-Semitic and, selling out or betraying the Jewish people, but several Polish people help the Spiegelmans at different points during the story. This is an incident here where, again, his commanding officer's, yelling at him because his gun is cold, meaning he hasn't been shooting. He finally takes aim at somebody, shoots somebody. He says that here, a guy, with like a tree camouflage thing on or something like that. It held up a hand to show it was hurt, to surrender, but it kept shooting and shooting until finally the tree stopped moving. Who knows? Otherwise, he could have shot me. So Spiegelman, besides living under occupation, besides going to Auschwitz, serves in the army and even, engages in combat to some extent with the Germans. So here's sort of the reversal of the earlier scene. Now he's being set upon by the Germans, again, portrayed as cats. And now they're yelling at him because the gun is hot. So first he's getting yelled at because the gun is cold. Now he's getting yelled at because the gun is hot. And he's marched away. They find the guy that he shot. He's definitely dead, which is not a surprise here. This is a very chilling image here. This German officer, portrayed as a cat with the Nazi, regalia on and things like that. The Jewish prisoners have to sleep in tents. The regular Polish prisoners, the so-called regular Polish prisoners, get to sleep in heated cabins, while the Jewish Polish people basically sleep in tents. So they talk about that. Here's another thing, they're asking for volunteers to work. And I think this is an important part of the Holocaust, or really this is, I guess, technically prior to the Holocaust, which begins really, I guess you could say, in 1942, when the Germans realized that they're losing the war, and they basically set upon what they call the final solution. And it's their decision to basically exterminate the entire Jewish race, or at least as much as they can. Or you could date the Holocaust back, sooner to when the Nazis first take power and start rounding up the Jews into ghettos and things like that. But it happened in a very sort of, almost a gradual process, and that the decision to exterminate the Jews did not really come about until 1942. Prior to that, it was stuff like you're seeing here, where they're being mistreated, they're being treated like they're subhuman or second-class citizens. Their property is being stolen, but they're also, and this is again something that's not maybe emphasized as much, they're also being treated as a workforce, and they were constantly trying to exploit, get basically slave labor out of the Jewish people. And it really kind of, gives you a sense of this constant exploitation of labor that's going on as well. So you see some of the things that Spiegelman's doing as a laborer, the mistreatment again on the part of the Germans. He has a dream where an ancestor comes to him and tells him that he's going to make it out of there, and he does, of course. And he does eventually get released. He was told that he was going to go back to his home, but the train drives through his hometown. You see a picture here, interesting, of Poland and how Poland was kind of divided up. So you see part of it is directly annexed to Germany, meaning basically it becomes German territory. Part of it becomes sort of a puppet government under the control of the Germans. And then the eastern part of Poland is basically annexed by the Soviet Union, who also invaded Poland from the east. Here's a very chilling image here, Jewish soldiers being knelt down and shot by Germans. And you'll see, one of many, of course, disturbing scenes in the story. Here's a scene here where he goes out to urinate. He gets shot at by a soldier. He's forced to urinate right next to where this guy is sleeping. Just to give you a sense again of the mistreatment. Now here's a very sort of clever metaphor that Spiegelman uses here, which is that to pass as Polish, Spiegelman's father wears a mask, basically a pig mask over his face. I think it's a very sort of clever metaphor for what is known as passing, which is that, if you were Jewish, you could sometimes occasionally pass yourself off as being non-Jewish. And you could do that by various ways. Many Jewish people change their names to fit into non-Jewish society. So Jack Kirby, the famous comic book artist who created, most of the famous Marvel Comics characters, born Jacob Kurtzberg, but changed his name to fit in more. Stan Lee, born Stanley Lieber, much more, ethnic sounding name, changed his name, to conceal that, presumably. So that was a fairly common thing back then. And again, Spiegelman sort of visualizes this metaphor by Spiegelman's father basically wearing a pig mask, which you can see the string here, covering the back of the back of the head, which I think was a clever touch. He gets reunited with his family. Again, very heartbreaking scene. Is reunited with his son Rishu, who again does not survive the experience of the war, and you'll see that depicted later on. You see some of scenes like this, which I think are kind of sweet, where like Spiegelman sort of like laying down, this is Spiegelman as an adult, almost laying down like a child at the feet of his father, basically like taking in everything he has to say. Here's a famous scene where, Vladik throws away Spiegelman's coat and forces him to wear this kind of, ugly looking coat here. Kind of a more of a humorous scene, sort of showing, Vladik being a kind of overbearing parent. And, again, we'll talk about that more next class. I mean, some people object to the way that Vladik is portrayed in the present day. They're almost like Spiegelman is trying to get the sympathy on himself, sort of transfer the sympathy from the father to himself. I don't know if I necessarily agree with that criticism, but this is something that people say. Here's a very disturbing image here. I guess, this is part of the reason why the book got banned in Tennessee. Unfortunately, it's 1:20. Oh wait, no, I have until 1:30, right? Okay, I'm sorry. I thought I was out of time. I actually have 10 more minutes. All right, that's good actually. So here's another interesting scene. And again, I mean, people don't often talk about the art in Maus as much, which I think is mostly good. I think, there are other artists who I like better than Spiegelman in terms of style and things like that. But most people talk about the story because of its content, not because of its form, but because of what the story is about. But again, form matters a lot as well. I mean, this would actually be a rare example where people probably overemphasize the content rather than the form. Whereas oftentimes we talk about the formal aspect of things and leave aside the content. This would be a rare example of the opposite case. But this, I think, is a very sort of interesting, formal aspect as well, where you see the scene here with the window, sort of separating the different groups of people. And then in the panels below that, you see a recreation, basically, of that exact scene on top, basically splitting it up so you see the different members of the family. So you see these three people here, portrayed down here, the next group of three people there, portrayed here, the two people sitting at the end of the table, the grandparents sitting there, and so on and so forth. So I think that was a kind of, clever visual motif. And again, he mentions there was, 12 of us living in his father-in-law's house. And again, very sad because most of these people are not going to survive the war. In fact, Spiegelman and his wife are, in fact, later on forced to basically give up the grandparents to the Germans, which is really, tragic. But, they would say that they were basically forced to. Otherwise, they were all going to be taken away. So you see stuff like that going on. And again, you see what daily life was like for people back then. They were still trying to sort of eke out existence somehow, living under occupation. And one of the things that comes out about Vladek is how resourceful he is. Right, he's very clever. He's very. He doesn't seem to panic. He doesn't seem to get that disturbed by things, and he's always able to sort of keep his calm and his composure and sort of figure out a way out of these situations by bargaining with people and making deals and things like that. You see again, Germans, ripping people off, saying they're going to buy this guy's furniture, and then they just take it and then threaten to kill him when he asks for money. You see regular scenes of, again, violence against the Jewish people. And then, always cutting back and forth scenes like this, like Vladek in the present day, on his exercise bike. They're talking about, again, giving away their son so that he'll be safe. Again, what's coming, so it's very tragic. Here's a very disturbing image: cartoon mice hanging in the town square. The caption says here that they hang there one full week. I mean, they just literally left them hanging there for a week. Really barbaric. This next image here again shows another sort of clever visual imagery here. Spiegelman basically thinking about it, being haunted literally by the image of seeing these men hanging in the town square. Here he gets set upon by the Germans, again just barely thinks of a way to get out of this situation here. Showing again the hiding spots the various people would use. Here the grandparents who were forced to live in this small cramped space behind this fake wall in a storage shed. Again, very much reminiscent of something like Anne Frank hiding up in the attic. Okay, so this is the scene here where they're forced to give away the grandparent. I believe this is his wife Anya's grandparents. So one of their members is taken. Mr. Zabelberg, you and your wife must come with us. If the Carmios don't turn up in 3 days, you two will be sent in their place. He still had a little protection from the Gamende, so they took only him away, not his wife. He sat there a few days and he sent us a note. He wrote that we had to give over the grandparents, even if they only took him away now. Next, they would grab his wife and then the rest of the family. So what happened? We had to deliver them. They thought it was too. I'm bad with some of these pronunciations, but I'll try my best. Theresienstadt. They were going. So they lie to the grandparents. They tell them that they're going someplace, but instead they end up getting sent away to Auschwitz and to the gas chambers. So chilling stuff. I mean, giving away your own grandparents, basically sacrificing them to save the rest of the family. I mean, pretty brutal stuff. But again, I mean, that's what happened. You see again another scene, everyone lining up here, separating into two lines. The one line, old people, families with lots of kids, and people without work cards, all going to the left. That means that they're going to the gas chamber, basically. For those who are able to work, and again, this sort of emphasizing this need that the Germans were constantly trying to exploit the Jews as a source of labor as well, which I don't think is often emphasized enough, is important. So anyone who was productive, anyone who was able to work, basically could continue to live, provided that they worked essentially as a slave for the Germans. But people who were not able to work, or were seen as too much of a drain on resources, like people with lots of kids, were basically sent to the gas chambers, including, of course, the kids. So very chilling stuff there. This guy wants to be with his family, so he actually crosses over to the so-called bad side. You never see him again. This is Spiegelman, in the present day talking to his, I don't, even though it's all in black and white, I never had problems, figuring out when they were talking about the past and talking about the present day. I thought it was always communicated fairly well. I don't know if anyone else had that problem. But usually, I mean, you can see because they're in this kind of domestic setting of sitting in the kitchen or something like that. So here's Spiegelman's stepmother basically complaining about his father. Where are we? Chapter 5. Okay, so we're making pretty good progress here. We're at the second to last chapter. So every chapter more or less begins this way, or every chapter more or less begins and ends this way. With Spiegelman in the present day, dealing with his father, oftentimes again emphasizing how difficult his father is, and then the chapter ends that way as well. And then you basically go into the past. So this is interesting too, and this is a previous story done by Spiegelman in a very different art style. Basically, him talking about the death of the suicide of his mother. This is also from the early 1970s. So it's kind of like, a comic within a comic. You even see him here in his mouse form, basically, looking at the storyline. And then this actually then segues into the actual story. And this is how it was originally printed. Again, a drastically different art style. They're portrayed as human figures, though in a very distorted kind of expressionistic kind of style. And it shows Vladik in a very different light. I mean, here he is, not being cool and composed, very much, an emotional wreck, to the point he even, jumps on top of the coffin during the mother's funeral, or something I've never seen before. I've been to many funerals, well, not many, but I've been to several funerals before. I've never seen anything like that happen. I mean, very, very chilling stuff. Spiegelman feels a lot of guilt. He feels people are blaming him for his mother's death. He recounts a scene here where his mother came in to see him the last time that he saw her, asking him, very sad way, Artie, you still love me, don't you? He kind of turns away from her. He says, I turned away, resentful of the way she tightened the umbilical cord. And he just, in a very dismissive way says, yeah, sure, Ma. And then she just leaves and walks out the door. That's the last time he ever saw his mother. But then the ending is very weird. And then he says, you murdered me, Mommy, and left me here to take the rap. So what does he mean by saying that his mother murdered him, like a soul? It's not quite clear. And later on, at the very end of this book, he refers to his father as a murderer as well. So you sort of revisit that idea later on in the story. But okay, so we're making pretty good progress here. Although now I say that, I check the time, it's 1:28. So oh God, this is probably the worst scene in the whole book. I mean, a German officer, or soldier rather, literally smashing a child against the wall. You can see like the blood spattering, stuff like that. I mean, absolutely brutal stuff. I think by far this is probably the most brutal scene in the whole book, at least in all of book one. I mean, just god awful. And then of course it leads him to think, well, what about so at this point, Spiegelman's father has sent his son to live away with other people, supposedly for their safety. But what happens? They get set upon by the Germans. This is the woman who's watching them, supposed to be taking care of her son. No, I won't go to their gas chambers, and my children won't go to the gas chambers. Well, they're not all her children. Riccio is not her child. She says, Bibi, Lonya, Riccio, come here quickly. And so she poisons them. Always Tasha carried around her neck some poison. She killed not only herself, but also the 3 children, including their son. So, I don't know what else I can say about that. I mean, horrible, obviously. Spiegelman's father, being that, he speaks English as a second language, has his own sort of dialect of speaking. And I think Spiegelman captures that fairly well. Spiegelman's sometimes, criticized for his writing as well. Like he's not, particularly, interesting writer, doesn't have a good ear for dialogue. But I think he does at least capture the way, his father spoke in his very, idiosyncratic way of speaking. Here you see another sort of, interesting visual panel. You see the people hiding, and the sort of the panel borders sort of delineate the scene. So you see the upstairs area, the hiding place, the coal where they're hiding behind. You even see, him, the one German, walking down the storm cellar, and they see his legs coming in through the next panel there. And, again, very much reminiscent of the Anne Frank story and things like that. People just walking down the street, and you'll see like a dead body, in the street sometimes, bargaining selling things, giving away valuables, oftentimes to family members to get them to help you out basically, and which Spiegelman doesn't understand really, but the father has to explain it to him. All right, so it's 1:30. So I got through most of it. Most of chapter 5 out of 6 chapters. Does anyone have any comments on anything? All right, then basically we'll just finish this up and then move on to book 2 next class. Which basically book 1 ends basically with them going to Auschwitz. Spiegelman's parents going to Auschwitz. So then book 2 basically chronicles their life in Auschwitz basically, and also sort of a little bit afterwards as well. But all right, I hope you're enjoying this. It's like I said, different, change of pace basically from what we're normally doing. But hope you're getting something out of it. All right, so if there's no other questions, then I'll just see everyone next class then. All right, so take care, everyone.